Okay. So I call this meeting to order. My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Clerk, but the sound tests have been done and everybody conforms to the sound quality standards. We'd like to welcome Mr. Brad Corson, Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of Imperial Oil Limited, along with Simon Younger, Senior Vice President, Upstream. Welcome, Mr. Corson. Welcome back to the committee. It's a pleasure to have you today. Thank you for making yourself available. We'll just start right away with your 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Brad Corson. I'm the CEO of Imperial, and I'm joined here today by Simon Younger, the Senior Vice President of the Upstream at Imperial. Thank you for the invitation to participate today, and I would like to express my sincere thanks to the Chair and the committee members for your flexibility in accommodating our schedules. I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today in Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. In this meeting today and every day that we carry out our business across the country, we do so on the traditional territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived on and cared for these lands for generations. We are all entrusted to care for the land, and that is a responsibility Imperial takes very seriously. We come today fully committed to our reconciliation journey. As this committee knows, I was here on April 20th, and at that time, I unequivocally apologized for what happened at Curl and remain deeply sorrowful for the events that occurred and the community fears that stem from it. Since our last appearance, we have focused on 3 key areas. First, we have been working very hard on our mitigation efforts, and I will say more on that shortly. And second, we are continuing to ensure that the environment is not adversely affected and communities are safe. And third, we have increased our communication and engagement with our neighboring communities. And on this last point, I want to emphasize that Imperial is communicating with the Athabasca chiefs and presidents on a regular basis by phone, text, and email. We also provide a weekly status update on our website. We have met with communities approximately 70 times, and we've arranged more than 20 community site visits to Curl. And I personally met face-to-face with several chiefs and presidents as recently as October. I want to emphasize we are collaborating with Indigenous leaders and their communities to align on improved communication protocols to ensure we are meeting their expectations, and we continue to support independent water and wildlife testing by all communities. Since we last spoke 7 months ago, I'm pleased to report that the measures we have put in place to expand and optimize our seepage monitoring and collection systems are working, and there continues to be no indication of adverse impacts to human life, wildlife, vegetation, or fish populations in nearby river systems. Furthermore, I can confidently report that the seepage has not reached any waterways, including the Firebag River, the Muskeg River, the Athabasca River, or any other water bodies, including those in the Northwest Territories. There is no indication of any risk to drinking water for communities downstream. This has been confirmed by testing done by government and our own testing, which number more than 2,000 samples taken from more than 500 locations, including along the banks and within the Firebag River. Independent testing, as you are aware, has been undertaken by communities as well. The focus of our mitigation work has been on expanding and improving our seepage interception system and our monitoring network. We have installed interception trenches and sumps along with a well point vacuum system, and we have added liners to on-site ditches. Over the summer, we increased the number of pumping wells from 19 to 27, with an additional 28 to be completed this winter. We have also completed 165 monitoring wells with an additional 171 to be drilled over the coming months. This brings the total number of monitoring wells to almost 500 and will help us to further enhance our understanding of the geology and hydrogeology at site. This work is reviewed by a third party, and we share the results with regulators and communities. We are very pleased that these newly installed groundwater mitigations are working as intended and are preventing further off-site migration of impacted water. Preliminary delineation data indicates there is no deep seepage found beyond 1.3 kilometers north of the Curl lease. And for context, the Firebag River is an additional 2 kilometers north beyond that. We test and monitor the remaining distance to the river, and there is no indication of risk to water or wildlife. And furthermore, there are no drinking water sources in this area. Ongoing monitoring and sampling are an integral part of all our operations, and we continue to provide regular reports to communities, the AER, and federal regulators on the work I have just outlined. Notwithstanding this positive update, we remain committed to enhancing these mitigations if future data demonstrates they are required. On behalf of the more than 5,000 employees at Imperial, I want you all to know that this matter continues to have the full attention of our company. I would like to re-extend my offer to the committee to come to Curl, where you can all see firsthand the work we are doing to protect the communities and the environment where we operate and to earn back your trust. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Merci, Monsieur Corson.
Thank you, Mr. Corson. And concerning your invitation, indeed, the committee does intend to submit a budget request so that the committee could travel to Curl in the new year. So we hope in the springtime, perhaps, that the temperature would be better. So without further ado, we'll begin our first round of questions. And I believe it's Ms. Goodridge who's online who will begin the questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Corson for coming back to committee. It has been 8 months approximately since the last time you guys were at this committee, and I'm wondering, you gave a recap of the 3 key areas, but I'm wondering if you can go into more specifics, specifically around what processes you've changed when it comes to the communication engagement with your neighboring communities. I understand what you guys are doing with this particular incident and how you're responding. You've laid that out relatively clearly, but what have you guys done as a company to prevent these communication failures from going on as we go forward?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And first, before I answer, I just want to congratulate you on the birth of your baby since we were last together in committee here. And with respect to that, we have undertaken a thorough review of our communication procedures and protocols across the whole company, not just specific to Curl. And what we learned from that is we had very robust and consistent protocols and procedures in place for what I would describe as emergency notifications in terms of notification to communities, surrounding neighbors, regulatory requirements, and all of those appropriate notifications. When it came to other incidents, what we found was some inconsistencies and clearly some gaps as it related to communities. And so what we've been doing since we last met here is internalizing those learnings and now looking for how we can enhance them. And as part of that, we have put in place more consistent protocols. We have elevated, if you will, expanded the types of information we would share with communities. And we're obviously demonstrating that with the Curl incidents. And as it relates to Curl, in our most recent quarterly meetings that we've had with each of the communities, we've been sharing those enhanced protocols, seeking feedback from them, and ensuring that they meet their expectations as we go forward. So I feel quite good about kind of the steps we've taken, and again, we're going to continue to work with the communities to ensure that they meet their requirements.
So I'm assuming that you have written down processes and procedures in place that you guys have updated, and this is now a company standard. Would you be willing or able to share at least some like very specific pieces of what used to happen and what you're doing now? Because I think that's the crux.
We certainly have that outlined. As I mentioned, we're going through this kind of final step, if you will, to validate that with the communities. And so, you know, certainly we can make available what we have. I would prefer to wait till we've gone through that next step to ensure that we are meeting their expectations on what types of incidents they want communicated, on what timeliness, and to what level in their organizations. And once that's done, then we will have finalized that.
And what kind of procedures and processes have you put in place for internal communications so as an issue that might become a big deal can be communicated faster within your organization so that you have everything in place? I think that that's also an important piece because I believe that was a failure as well from the last time.
Yeah, it's a critical piece. What we found is we do have quite a robust, what I would describe as a matrix of reporting standards for internal incidents that look at a wide variety of factors around risk considerations, and that determines what level it's escalated to in the organization, and do
in what
these
time standards exceed government requirements?
Well, certainly they're consistent with government requirements, but there are certainly things that get reported internally that don't warrant a government reporting requirement. So I would say they're more expansive than government requirements, but they fully meet government requirements.
So you've talked about that there were 20 community visits. Can you give an explanation as to who was part of those community visits? How large were those community visits? Were they open to the public? A little bit more information would probably be really helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I might ask Simon Younger here to provide a little more context with the visits. But, I would just emphasize that we have continued to reach out to the communities to encourage them to visit our site, just like I have with this committee. We want to be very transparent. We believe we have made significant progress, and we want to demonstrate that. So we're not constraining or limiting anybody. But with respect to the 20, maybe Simon can offer just a few examples.
We have to move on to the next questioner, but I'm just wondering if it's if it might be possible. I understand that your communications protocols, external communications protocols, are still being finalized. Would it be possible to submit to the committee when those are finalized, kind of a list of the changes, so that we can see the before and after? It would be, as opposed to just sending us the protocols and then us having to say, okay, what changed here? Maybe if there was some kind of summary of where the improvements or amendments were made. Mr. Younger, you'll probably have an opportunity later on to provide that answer. But we have to go now to Mr. Longfield.
I'm sorry, Chair. I believe it's Mr. Van Couverden that's leading for us.
Okay, well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for joining us today and coming back to the committee, Mr. Corson. My first question is to you, Mr. Corson, and if you'll indulge me, I have many questions, so if you could keep your answers as brief as possible, I'd appreciate it. You could allow me to get through my remarks. So today, Mr. Corson, you suggested that no adverse impacts on wildlife or human life have occurred, and you said there was no evidence of toxic tailings leakage into water systems, such as the Athabasca River. That claim has been widely refuted by Indigenous groups and other scientists who have appeared before this committee since April the 20th, many others online as well, widely claiming that this 5.3 million liters of leakage has entered into natural systems like the Athabasca River. So could you be clear, Mr. Corson, when you apologize for this, what has been referred to as a communications error, what precisely are you apologizing for if none of these process-affected waters have impacted natural waterways?
Well, I've been apologizing for the fact that the incidents occurred and all the communications around them, and the fact that that had created concern and fear in the communities, and it damaged our trust with the Indigenous communities, and we're working hard to rebuild that trust. But I would restate that we are confident that none of these incidents impacted the waterways.
Okay, I would repeat again that that claim has been widely refuted by affected communities. In particular, Mr. Corson, data filed to the Oil Sands Monitoring Program shows that sulfates at a sampling station in the Muskeg River have been climbing drastically since March 2022. That's within a year. They are 18 times higher than the 2021 average, and that sampling station is just south of the Curl Lease. That is where the releases have triggered the protection order on the north side. Does that sound familiar, Mr. Corson?
Well, I'm familiar with the Curl Leases, of course. I'm not familiar with the data that you refer to. I do know that all of our data sampling and analysis has concluded that no process-affected water has made its way to those water bodies. What we also know is sulfates are naturally occurring, and there can be a great amount of variability over time. So,
okay, so it's possibly just a coincidence that sulfates are occurring at 18 times the average just following this release. I understand that to be your position. Thank you. Now, Mr. Corson, this Curl site disaster highlights the apparent inability for oil companies such as Imperial to manage their waste. And actually, Mr. Pusher was here from the Alberta Energy Regulator acknowledging that leakage is actually anticipated with these earthen dams, as he referred to them. So contamination of natural waterways and groundwater isn't actually a failure of the system or the regulations or a communications error, as your organization has consistently called this. Leakage is actually a feature of them. Now, since Indigenous communities were not notified, we've also seen a rise in some very specific and unique cancers that are linked directly to some contaminants from tailings ponds. How do we, people are literally dying from a rare form of cancer that's not seen anywhere else. And your company is claiming that none of these tailings toxic contaminants are entering natural waterways. This is where Indigenous people have hunted and drank from for generations and generations. How do we rationalize this stark and rapid rise in rare forms of cancer that are linked directly to effluent from your industry?
well, I have great empathy for the people that are suffering from cancer. Cancer is a horrible disease that affects many of us in many different ways. With respect to those specific cases, I'm not aware that they have been directly linked to our operations, and I would maintain again that there's no indication of contamination from our facility in the waterways. But I do believe that, it's important that the local areas, the government, that everybody works together to better understand the sources of that cancer.
So do you believe that the obligation is incumbent upon Indigenous communities, the government, private sector, activists, to prove that these contaminants even though they're scientifically directly related to the types of cancer we're discussing here, are not related to your industry? Or do you think that ought to be the responsibility of an industry who continually profits to the tune of $10 billion a year as a result of what they're taking from the land and leaving behind? Whose obligation is it to identify clearly that these cancers are not linked directly to your activities in the oil sands?
Well, we continue to demonstrate the quality of our operations. We continue to demonstrate, through extensive sampling, that we are not impacting the waterways. So we take full responsibility for demonstrating the integrity of our operations.
Responsibility,
I'm not a
Mr.
medical
Corson?
professional, so I'm not in a position to comment on what's required to better understand the source of those cancers.
Well, I think I would say, as a member of this government and as a Canadian, that obligation rests solely on the shoulders of Imperial Oil to demonstrate clearly that this is not a communications failure, that leakage ought not to be built into the design of your operations. Mr. Corson, it's...
On doit s'arrêter là, malheureusement, on a dépassé.
We'll have to stay there. I'm sorry. Your 6 minutes are up. We'll move now with Ms. Posey. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'm going to continue in the same vein as my colleague, Mr. Van Couverden. You're saying that there's no impact on the environment or human health from the Kearl spill. So I'm surprised at that. Even with the Alberta Energy Regulator, they're talking about a communications problem. And that's not what I see there as an analysis. So all of these products, you have said you've put in measures with the Indigenous communities and you've had good participation on their behalf. But your statements saying that there are no negative impacts, you're saying it's on the basis of analyses done by the government and by your company. You're saying that some communities have carried out independent analyses. So have you consulted the independent analyses that were done?
In fact, I would just clarify that even the testing that we do is really done by independent third parties. We have hired Indigenous-owned contractors to do all of the sampling, and then those samples are sent to a government-certified third-party laboratory. The results of those samples are then returned back to the Indigenous-owned companies to process the results and conclusions, and then that information is ultimately shared back to us, and we share it then broadly with all the communities.
Je vois la
So
suite
it's very independent.
I can see that you're going back to communications, but in the report, the sampling that was done by a third party, that report is on the website of the AER, and it says that the two main areas where samples were taken are in the north investigation and northeast investigation zones, and that's what's said in the report. So these don't correspond to the overflow or of those 5.3 million liters. So it's not, you're talking about a small amount of seepage in 2022. So why did you concentrate your samples to exclude the areas under which you have received the order from the Environmental Protection Agency of Canada?
Yeah, we're not excluding any areas. And in fact, over the last 7-8 months, we have gathered over 2,000 samples from approximately 500 locations, both adjacent to our lease and moving out away from our lease. And that data has been analyzed as I just described. We've also hired a separate third-party company to help with the analysis of all that data. They have provided a report that we have now shared with the AER and we've shared with the communities, and it has consistent conclusions with what I've been sharing. The other thing I just would like to clarify is the 5.3 million liters that you reference, that was from a single incident where we had a drainage pond overflow, and the extent of that spill was contained in a very small area adjacent to our lease. It was very cold
Next.
weather, and it froze, and we immediately cleaned it up.
Mais on va parler justement de cette.
Yes, but I want to talk about that small area, because if the leak that you spoke about in your comments covered 1.3 kilometers as a zone, and how can you assure us or reassure the population, and particularly the Indigenous communities, that that didn't go any further if you haven't gone to do testing outside of the area of your lease boundary?
We actually have done extensive testing. So what I was describing in my opening statement was that as we looked at kind of all of the wells that we've been drilled, all of the access to fluids, and analyzed it, the furthest that we have seen any impact is 1.3 kilometers off of our lease. But we have looked beyond that. In fact, we've taken samples all the way at the river, both in the banks and in the river, and confirmed that there is no continuation of that plume. And the whole reason we have this monitoring system is so we can continue to validate that it is not going any further. And now with the pumping and interception system that we've expanded, our objective is to effectively move that plume back on lease and eliminate it from spreading any further.
Écoutez, pour le temps qui me reste, je vais.
Look, with the time I have left, I would like to follow up again on what Mr. Van Couverden said. Since that overflow, there have been analyses done of this water, and we've seen high levels of arsenic, of iron, aluminum, and these are levels that weren't comparable with what existed before this incident. You were saying to say to Mr. Van Couverden that that indeed that was what was demonstrated. So do you not believe that you should consider these analyses and take them more seriously?
We're taking them very seriously, and that's why just since we were last together, we've added 175 additional wells that allow us to intercept this seepage and mitigate it. We have several hundred more wells planned between now and the end of the year over the winter season. And it's all so we can ensure that we are not impacting the environment any more than we already have, and to mitigate that in the future. I will acknowledge that on lease, not off lease, but on lease, we have some incidents of higher levels of arsenic, as an example. Arsenic is naturally occurring in this area, but we've seen elevated levels. And so that's part of our cleanup, is to deal with this, but it has not gone off lease.
Merci. Alors, on poursuit maintenant avec Mme McPherson. Bienvenue.
We'll go now to Ms. McPherson. Welcome to the committee.
Coming back, Mr. Carson, to answer our questions. Obviously it's very important that you are here, and I, like many of my colleagues in this committee, have heard very different stories than what you have come to committee to share with us. So I'm going to walk through some of the details. Obviously, all of us here, myself included, are deeply troubled by what has happened and continues to happen at the Curl site, and what it means for tailings ponds, for the environment, for fresh water, and for the Indigenous communities that are living downstream. We know that the Curl mine was built in a highly sensitive area. It was built right next to the wetlands feeding the Firebag and Muskeg River systems. The review for the mine and tailings site recognized that there was higher permeability in the area proposed for the tailings ponds, and that seepage from this tailings pond could impact significant surface waters. The joint review panel stated that, and I quote, "The proposed location overlies permeable superficial deposits that will likely be the primary pathway for transmission of process-affected tailings water." And the joint panel, Mr. Corson, also noted that if unmitigated, this seepage will likely impact surface water bodies to the north, specifically the Firebag River and its 3 tributaries, and that groundwater and surface water quality would degrade. So in other words, this was put into a place where it was expected to seep into the environment. And as a condition of approval for this site, the AER, the Alberta Energy Regulator, required Imperial Oil to conduct and again I quote, a detailed hydrogeological survey covering a 5-kilometer radius of the plant to identify groundwater flow patterns, depth to water table patterns, patterns of groundwater movement, and hydrologic gradients. Did Imperial Oil ever do this? Did they ever complete this hydrogeological survey?
I would certainly expect so. You know, the time frame you noted was before my time with the company, but
Well,
I'm
as the
sure
CEO, you should probably be double-checking that that's
as
happened.
part of the regulatory process, we did complete it. And I would just note that
Well,
as you
actually,
were
that was
describing
just a
the
yes/no
findings-
question, and I don't want to be rude, but you do know how much time we have. So if you have, in fact, completed that, I'd ask that you submit that study to the committee. We'd like to be able to look at it.
Okay. We'll happily follow up on that. for you.
Yeah, and if you haven't, then we may have to find out why that is the case. So as predicted, Imperial Oil's water monitoring reports have showed that there is toxic seepage from this tailings pond, that it was excessive, that there were high levels of dangerous toxins that were seeping through the groundwater. You know, we're talking about dangerous substances, as you know, like sulfate and sulfide, lead, arsenic, methylmercury, selenium, nitrate, PAHs. Mr. Corson, Imperial Oil knew the risk to the environment, and you knew that you were not capturing and containing all the seepages. We know this because data from the 2 off-lease monitoring wells on the north side of the site showed high levels of toxins associated with tailings, high levels of PAHs that, as my friend from the Liberal Party has mentioned, are linked to bladder and other cancers. Those are the cancers that members of the Athabasca and Chippewa First Nation have suffered at an exceptionally high rate. You know, you say that somebody should get to the bottom of this. You say it's not your responsibility. I would beg to differ, sir. As far back as 2019, Imperial Oil knew that the containment system was not working. In May 2022, you discovered what you call brown sludge on the surface, and you must have known what this was. It looked exactly like the brown sludge that sits atop the tailings ponds. You must have known, Mr. Corson, that your containment system was, again, not working. And yet you didn't inform the Indigenous communities, you didn't tell the communities that live downstream, and you did nothing to mitigate that. It wasn't until March 2023, 10 months after the discovery of the brown sludge and 6 weeks after 5.3 million litres spilled in the Environmental Protection Order, that you started constructing additional monitoring and containment wells. In April, you came to this committee and claimed you had solved the problem. You told me, you told other members of this committee that the containment system was a closed-loop system. If I had asked you in 2020, Mr. Carson, is your containment system working? You would have told me yes. Was it?
I would have told you yes then, and I would tell you today that we are continuing to adjust our seepage interception system to ensure its long-term effectiveness.
If it was working, why did you have to add additional wells in 2021 and again in 2023?
Because, as I mentioned last time I was at committee, we identified that there was an additional layer of groundwater that the prior studies during design had not identified. And so, as a result of identifying the surface seepage, we then have expanded that system to ensure we're addressing those as well.
So you stated that the toxic plume extends 1.3 kilometers. You said that 1.3 kilometers is more than halfway to the Firebag River, that it includes boggy land feeding the Firebag River, actual tributaries, and of course the small lake known as Water Body 3. We know there are still toxins seeping into this environment. The head of the AER has admitted that to this committee a couple weeks ago. The off-lease monitoring wells are still measuring PAHs. Downstream communities have reported sulfur, iron in their community-based monitoring since the spill. You say that drinking water isn't affected downstream. Honestly, Mr. Pusher, sorry, I got you confused. Mr. Carson, to be perfectly honest, I don't understand how any Canadian can take what you're saying to this committee as truth. I find all of your testimony to be massively problematic, and it doesn't align at all with people who are living on the land that are in those communities and the measuring and monitoring that we've actually seen. I have very big problems with your testimony, Mr. Carson.
Mr. Corson, do you want to take 30 seconds to maybe respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first I would say, you know, we continue to be very transparent with all of our data. We're happy to provide all of those analyses to the committee, as we are to the communities and as we are to the regulator. But that data continues to show that there is no impact to water. There's no adverse impact to wildlife. And that's what our data shows. That's what third-party data shows. Even the Alberta chief scientist recently came out with a report to validate that in their assessment, the drinking water was safe. And so we have an abundance of information and data that we can provide you to demonstrate the credibility of my statements.
Merci. Alors, on continue au deuxième tour. C'est Madame.
We'll continue during the second round. Ms. Goodridge, once again, will be asking questions. You have the floor.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Carson, there are, and you said it as much in your closing statement, of that there are 5,000 employees at Imperial. So there are 5,000 hardworking people that get up every day and go to work. And so it's very frustrating to me to have both the Liberal and the NDP and the Bloc just vilify an industry that is providing employment, not just for people in my region, but Imperial has an in-depth space that transcends just the Fort McMurray region. There's people that are employed in probably every single province, and yet they continue to just vilify yourself and your company. And I'm not here to give you somehow an out on this, but you've increased the number of wells. Why have you increased the number of wells?
And you're exactly right. You know, we have more than 5,000 employees that are working very diligently to provide safe, reliable, affordable energy to this whole country. And they take that responsibility very seriously, and I commend them for what they do on behalf of Canadians. We have expanded these monitoring wells and pumping wells because we did identify that there were gaps in the seepage interception system that was initially installed as part of the original design for Curl. And so as we have identified those gaps, we want to be quite prudent in mitigating those gaps. And so we've significantly expanded it. We are expanding it out of the abundance of caution. We're taking a very conservative approach. So when you look back at where we were at the beginning of this year, at the time the EPO was issued, relative to where we expect to be at the end of this winter season, we will have tripled the size of that seepage interception system. We will have tripled the number of wells that we use to ensure that there is no impact, adverse impact to the environment or wildlife or waterways. We take that very seriously. And, you know, we're going to do what it takes.
So it's a know better, do better. And I think that this is important to highlight, where the NDP member tried to push forward the idea that somehow you've increased the number of wells because you realize that everything is screwed up. The way how I read it, at least, was that you've increased the number of wells to ensure that nothing is screwing up and to ensure that you are protecting the environment. And it really aggravates me because through this entire study, we've seen time and time again members of the opposition that have almost no understanding of this industry. They have almost no understanding. They might say that perhaps they've seen a picture of the oil sands, so therefore they understand it.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Pearson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I take some offense to that. I am married to somebody who works within the sector. My father worked in the sector. My brother worked in the sector. I would prefer that not be.
It's not a point of order. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry that they get offended from the truth. It's very complicated when someone that is just going to vilify an industry because it's convenient. We are in a space where Canada needs to have energy. We need energy security. We could help prevent the war in Europe and shut down Putin's war machine if we were able to supply the world with clean Canadian energy. Unfortunately, through the LNG, this government has decided to not move forward with any of it. They say that
Ms.
there's
Goodrich,
no business
Ms. Goodrich, I'm not going to wait for a point of order. I really think you're departing from the subject matter of
you know what?
Anyway, continue, but please let's focus on the problem at hand, which is the Curl spill. Thank you.
But this is all related. If they're going to vilify the entire oil sands industry, which is exactly what they're trying to do in this study, then we are putting Canadian
Point of order,
energy
Mr. Chair.
security at risk.
Yes, Mr. Vancouver.
I believe the role of members of parliament in committee is to question the witnesses, not to be ambassadors for the operations of the oil sands in this instance. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Goodrich, but please, if you could narrow your focus, I think it would be appreciated.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not here to be an ambassador for the industry. I'm here to be an ambassador for the hardworking people that make their living working hard to make sure Canada has the energy it needs. And so my question to Mr. Carson through all of this is, what specific items have you done to ensure that this will not happen ever again?
Mr. Corson, you have about 20 seconds. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Well, as I stated in my opening statement, we're working on the mitigations, and that includes all of these monitoring wells. We've expanded our testing protocols. We've expanded our communication protocols. We're working hard to rebuild trust with all of our Indigenous communities and partners. And it's through all of those steps that we are confident that we will prevent this from occurring again.
Thank you. Mr. Longfield, is it Mr. Longfield who's next?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
If I have some time at the end, I'll share some with Mr. Vancouverden, but I also know he wants to try and get up next as well. So if I can get straight to it, with Mr. Corson, and thank you again for coming back. I know these are very difficult discussions to have, particularly in this type of a forum. I come from industry myself. I supplied into the oil and gas sector and steel sector and heavy industry across Canada, mining sector. Part of quality assurance is looking for root causes. And my question has two aspects to it. One is, how many tailings ponds does Imperial have? And are the lessons being learned from Curl being applied to other tailings ponds installations?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, we have one main tailings pond that serves that purpose. Over time, we will look to expand that as necessary to support our operations. This is the only operation of its type for Imperial where we have tailings ponds, but through other industry associations, we have been very deliberate about sharing our learnings with our other kind of colleague companies in the industry, and we participate in several networks. It's quite important that we all learn and that we all endeavor to get better and ensure this doesn't happen again, not for us, but for anybody.
Good. That's a great answer. Thank you. And as we know, the risk on one is the risk on all. We've heard some testimony about the design of the berms, whether they included clay or not, and they didn't. They were using basic substrates. There wasn't a liner being used. You're installing liners now. The technology that's being used, I think, as we work with the AER and Environment Canada, I think we need some more oversight on regulations in terms of tailings ponds design. Is that something that you could acknowledge, or do you have an opinion on that?
Well, certainly we want to employ best practices. And, you know, we participate, as I said, in several industry forums to ensure we are applying best practices, and those even go beyond just oil sands, but to other mining industries. You know, I'll defer to the regulators on whether more regulatory oversight is needed. I am aware that there are initiatives underway, both by the federal government and the provincial government, to put in place some working groups to explore other enhancements or different approaches to managing tailings. And we very much want to be a part of that because we endeavor to make this better.
Thank you. And now to pivot over to the health concerns. I mean, we've had 17 people die of rare bile duct cancer. The normal incidence is 1 in 100,000. We don't have 100,000. We don't have 10,000 people. We have a fraction of that number that are being affected by bile duct cancer. The energy regulator that spoke to us said, well, that's another department. Go to health. When you're working with the Chippewas of the Athabasca, in terms of monitoring and in terms of taking some of the $11 billion profits to be reinvested into communities such as the Chippewas, to see whether they could be involved in monitoring, to look into the health concerns that they have. Could you talk about the investments that you're making, both in financial terms and also in discussions with the impacts on their way of life and their society?
Certainly,
and then I'll turn over to Mr. Vancouver.
Okay, we place high priority and value on the relationships with the Indigenous communities.
But are you spending that money?
We are definitely spending money with them. I think last year we spent over $500 million with Indigenous communities.
Are they involved in the oversight?
Oversight of
Could they
what?
be involved in monitoring? Could they be involved in monitoring? Are they involved with monitoring? They want to be involved with monitoring.
Yeah, they're absolutely involved in the monitoring. All of the sampling we do is undertaken by Indigenous-owned companies. And so we work very hard to build, I would say, capacity in the Indigenous communities. And so that is a key tenet of ours. I would also comment, since we were last together, obviously mental health was a key consideration, a key concern with this situation. And so I'm pleased to say that we donated $250,000 to the Canadian Mental Health Association in Wood Buffalo, requesting it be specifically directed to the seven communities. So those are just a couple examples. There's many more.
On se tourne maintenant vers Madame Posé.
Ms. Posé now has the floor, 2.5 minutes. That's not a lot of time, Mr. Corson. So the member was saying earlier that we are vilifying the industry, and I think you would agree with me that we're not doing that when we're talking about contamination and rare cancers. I think we can agree on that. Now, you said the reality is complex, but I don't think by listening to false stories that will make them real. There are independent analyses that say the opposite of what you're saying. And I would ask you now, in your speech, you say that we remain committed to continuing with mitigation measures. And if data shows that we need to do something different in the future, we will. So what did you base that on?
Well, I base it on our commitment to correct this situation and make it right. And, we have been putting in place all these additional mitigations. And if we identify through
Monsieur Corson, je vous...
No, Mr. Corson, I want to speak specifically to the data because you said that if future data demonstrates they're required, I don't want to hear about good intentions. I want to know what data you've based this on. And yours, the government's, that of independent analyses, what data are you consulting?
Taken on board all data. And as I mentioned earlier, we've gathered, more than 2,000 samples over the last several months from 500 locations. We've hired a third-party consultant to help analyze that. They have recently produced a report, approximately 24,000 pages in length, that contain all this data, contain conclusions. And we're going to continue with those sort of
processes. Et les données futures que vous allez prendre.
The future data, where are you going to take this from? I understand that because you're repeating the same thing pretty much, but I want to come back again to your speech. You said that we are maintaining our analyses of water, and we do this for the community. So who pays for that? You'll understand that I'm asking that because personally, I don't think it should be up to the communities to pay for what's happened here. So you're saying that you maintain your support. How do you do that? Is it financial support you're talking about? Quickly, please.
Paid by our company. These 2,000 samples were by our company. We have an approved program with the AER that addresses what is the frequency for testing. Now, for all of these 500 monitoring wells that we have put in place, we will pay for that. We'll use third-party indigenous companies to do that. And we're going to continue. We're not doing it just for the short term. This will be a long-term undertaking, a long-term commitment.
Excellent. Merci. Merci. On passe maintenant.
Excellent. Thank you. And now Ms. McPherson.
You know, the Curl site is not the only site that's problematic. All of the tailings ponds, all of them, as far back as 2009, have shown that they are leaking. You know, we've seen that the Athabasca River is polluted with toxins from tailing ponds, and yet the seepage at Curl should be that final moment for us when we realize that we shouldn't be building next to wetlands. Unfortunately, right now, Alberta's approved a mine to sit right on top of the McClellan wetlands, and there is no way to stop the leakage to going into that wetlands. So I have two questions for you, Mr. Carson. First of all, you know, according to your operating license and government approvals, how far off-site are tailings or process-affected water allowed to seep, more or less than 1.3 kilometers? And if you have 2,000 sites that you are monitoring, why were you and this strong commitment to protecting wildlife, why were you needing to euthanize a black bear yesterday?
Well, first of all, we regret that there is seepage that has gone a kilometer or more off our lease, and that's why we're working diligently to mitigate that and ensure that it doesn't happen again.
But sir, the question was, according to your operating license and government approvals, how far off-site are the tailings allowed to seep, more or less than 1.3 kilometers? So you could just say more or less.
We expect those to be contained on lease, and any process-affected water is supposed to be recycled back to the process and treated.
More or less than 1.3 kilometers, sir?
That would be less.
Okay. And can you tell me about the black bear that had to be euthanized because of a failure to recognize with all of your monitoring that there was a den in the area?
Yeah, it was a very unfortunate situation. It is completely unrelated to the seepage incident that we're talking about.
Well, it does allow us to question a little bit your commitment to protecting wildlife and the environment.
We place a very high priority on protecting the wildlife. We went to great lengths, as we always do, to ensure that we would not impact any wildlife. In this situation, we were preparing a drilling site. The area had been previously swept by an indigenous contractor to confirm there were no bear dens in the area. None were identified. The area was then cleared safely, no impacts. We then were getting ready to move some additional equipment on site. We swept the area again with this indigenous contractor, did not find any signs of a bear den or any signs of habitat.
Well, obviously there was some. So obviously that was there in place,
Okay.
and I think my time is
Your time is
complete.
up. Yeah. So we'll go to Mr. Leslie for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious, will we be starting with the minister at 12 o'clock sharp?
But very shortly after. Like, I want to finish this round with Mr.
Will the minister stay the difference?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'll ask him. I don't doubt that he will.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate you being here today, and just to continue on the statements of the seepage was anticipated in the design of the Curl tailing system, and that the seepage interception system failed. It's what it was supposed to do, but it was unsuccessful. It seems like a bit of a technological failure. So I'm curious. Obviously, the impacts can be significant. What technologically beyond the additional wells being drilled, is the company's plan to try to technologically prevent this from happening again in the future?
Well, the basis for the wells is some kind of extensive work we have done with subject matter experts on the geology, the hydrogeology, to understand kind of the source of this additional aquifer, the source of additional groundwater that was contributing to this seepage pathway to the surface. And we continue to engage those consultants, and that's the basis for the additional monitoring wells, the additional pumping wells, the additional trenches, all of which are intended to now address any newfound learnings around the hydrogeology.
So you mentioned the newfound learnings. Is there, beyond the communications with the communities, which of course is important to rectify, is there any other approaches that you have learned thus far that you can share with us of how you will address this going forward, even if theoretical at this point, any kind of planned approaches, whether it be for this project or others, to try to prevent any other incidents from happening?
Well, I think there's several learnings for us, that go back to the original design. And again, that's what we're addressing, with this expanded seepage interception system. I think in the future, we'll want to take all those learnings on board. And again, we're sharing those learnings with others in industry, so that if they're progressing, tailings pond projects, that they're aware of the learnings that we had, with this seepage incident.
Could you expand on how that information is shared amongst industry, not partners, competitors? I think it's valuable, and it's important lessons to make sure that whatever company is building a project, it's prevented. How do you go about sharing that information?
There are specific industry networks and consortiums that focus on the oil sands industry, technical practices. So there's formal networks. There's also informal networks. For example, Imperial and myself are one of 6 founding members of the Pathways Alliance for Oil Sands. We as CEOs meet every single Friday to advance that project to reduce our emissions. And, when things like this come up in industry, we also take time to talk about these sort of incidents. What are we learning? The same with safety incidents, because we don't view these things as competitive in nature. We all need to be excellent in our performance in these areas, safety and the environment. So we collaborate.
Well, I can appreciate that. And further to that excellence or intent of excellence, what other measures do you take as a company in the surrounding area to preserve habitat, wildlife habitat, natural landscapes, above and beyond just the measures to try to limit the impacts of potential incident regarding the tailing pond? So more broadly speaking, what other kind of offset programs do you undertake to improve the local environment?
Yeah, I mean, we're, with respect to this incident and more generally our operations, both at Curl and other places, we will install protective fencing if necessary, to keep wildlife out of areas that they could be endangered. We have other systems in place to mitigate the landing of birds on ponds. And we are regularly doing surveys where we, again, hire indigenous contractors to come help us identify where there is risk of wildlife endangerment. And then from that, we will apply mitigations to ensure we avoid that.
So you mentioned the local contractors. The question regarding the bear, the incident happened very recently. What does that process look like, and why might that have failed to notice the den? I mean, they're trying to hide them.
15 seconds, please, Mr. Corson.
Well, I would say we're clearly investigating that. It just happened recently. We would not have expected a bear den to be there, and we went to great lengths to make sure we were informed whether there would be one, and that obviously failed, and we had a very disappointing incident with a bear that had to be euthanized.
Mr.
Really
Vancouver?
unfortunate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Corson, you were the highest paid CEO of a Canadian oil and gas company in 2022. Yet this was sadly not the only environmental disaster that your company was directly responsible for. Despite that, your pay nearly doubled in 2022 to $17 million. That's your personal pay. It's probably because your company posted record profits that year of over $11 billion. And I might add that you did that by increasing prices to consumers. Now, it's obvious to me and Canadians that there's a lot of cleaning up to do throughout the Kearl site, but more broadly in the oil sands. It's been referred to as the largest environmental disaster in Canada. These tailings ponds pose serious risk to human and animal health. They are designed to leak, and they leak millions of liters of tailings effluent into natural systems every single year. Mr. Corson, who should pay to clean up this environmental disaster? Taxpayers or you and your company being directly responsible for this contamination? Who should pay to clean up this mess and prevent future leaks and future harm to human health and the environment?
Well, first, I take exception to your characterization that this is an environmental disaster.
It's not my characterization, sir. I'm not an environmentalist. I'm a politician.
Well, the source of it, I would say I take
I'm
exception
both,
to that.
I guess. Thank you.
But, with respect to the incident that we've been talking about, we are taking full responsibility as a company to address it, to clean it up, and to ensure it doesn't happen again. We take full responsibility for that.
Well, I think responsibility is one thing. Accountability is another, Mr. Corson. And the AER was here just a couple of weeks ago. They seemed not to be accountable for these leakages. They deem you as responsible for the leakages and for the lack of communication to Indigenous communities. Accountability is different than responsibility. Accountability means somebody loses their job or you change your strategy. Who's lost their job at Imperial as a result of do you know what 5.3 million liters looks like?
Absolutely.
How many Olympic-sized swimming pools?
And we cleaned it up.
You still contend that none of that water entered natural water systems like the Athabasca River, resulting in higher cancer rates in people who drink directly from the Athabasca River and animals that drink directly from the Athabasca River.
Absolutely. Okay. We are confident it did not get into any waterways.
Okay. Well, testing, unfortunately, by third parties and others directly refutes that, sir.
I'd be interested in seeing that data because that conflicts with the data that we have and that we've shared with the regulator and the communities.
Again, I would call into question whether you have a reverse onus or an obligation to ensure that your practices aren't negatively impacting communities and the health of the upstream river.
Now, we do have a responsibility for that, and we take it very seriously.
Yeah. Mr. Corson, Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, has claimed that the Alberta oil sands represent the safest and most ethical, the cleanest fossil fuel extraction in the world. Do you claim that to be true, despite all the evidence that we've heard today, despite all of the environmental disasters that Imperial has been responsible for over the last decades with you at the helm?
These particular incidents are a disappointment to me and our company, and we've been, quite forward in apologizing for them. We've been quite proactive in taking the necessary steps to clean them up. We take great pride in our industry, and having spent 40 years in this industry working around the world, I feel quite good about the quality of these operations and the overall environmental performance. I'm quite proud of what we're doing to reduce our emissions. I'm quite proud of the steps we take to protect the environment. We certainly have some disappointments, and that's what I've admitted, and that's what we're working to correct. But I don't think they are fully characteristic of the whole industry and of our operations in general.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that you feel good, Mr. Corson. Canadians don't feel good about this situation. We're devastated by this situation. Frankly, it keeps people up at night. And it's killing people, and it's killing an entire ecosystem. I have one final question for you, Mr. Corson. Would you allow your family to drink water directly from the Athabasca River, as Indigenous communities have for millennia?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
in my series of questions, I talked about how they were vilifying. This is now getting into a space we've heard very clearly that the drinking water is safe. There is independent information saying that the drinking water is safe. This is getting into a point where this is an absolute.
I don't accept that point of order. I think it is relevant in the sense that what Mr. Van Koeverden is asking is sort of a double confirmation of the data, I guess, and I'm sure Mr. Corson can answer that.
In all honesty, Mr. Corson.
Okay, but we don't have much time left,
Okay.
so if you want Mr. Corson to answer. Mr. Corson? Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Corson.
With regard to the drinking water, certainly any water that has been tested and deemed safe, I would be happy to drink.
Okay, Mr. Corson. I thank you for appearing today. And on behalf of Canadians, I want to tell you that you're failing. You're failing Canadians and future generations. You're failing the environment.
So, thank you. It's been a very interesting discussion. It will be incorporated into our water study as we decided when this series of meetings began. Thank you for being here, Mr. Corson. Mr. Younger, we're going to take a quick break because we have the minister with us, and we're going to prepare for for onboarding the minister. And so we'll just take a short break and be right back. Thank you.
We will resume now with the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change. We welcome you following your very long trip. I know you haven't been back to Canada long, just yesterday morning. Okay. So welcome to the committee. And is your statement about 10 minutes or less? About 10 minutes, yeah. So go ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, I came back yesterday. I'm very happy to be here. So I'm pleased to join the committee members today to discuss the 2023-24 Supplementary Estimates B for my portfolio, which includes Environment and Climate Change Canada, Parks Canada, and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. With me today are Mr. Jean-François Tremblay, Deputy Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Karen Terrence Hubbard, President of the Impact Assessment Agency, Andrew Francis, Vice President, Vice Finance, Parks Canada, and Andrew Campbell, Senior Vice President of Operations Canada, and Linda Drainville, and John Moffat as well from Environment and Climate Change Canada. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, who have been long stewards of the environment that we share today. I want to help build strong partnerships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. This is essential for climate change and to protect nature. It is just as essential as the funding we're going to talk about today. As I said earlier, I'm just back from COP28 in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and jet lag won't stop me from being proud of our country's progress and ambitious commitments to reduce emissions. I'm also proud to be part of a government that devotes a considerable budget to these efforts. Mr. Chair, from coast to coast, Canada is warming at a rate twice as fast as the global average. And I don't need to tell you that we're all suffering the effects and the costs, too. In 2022, we felt that climate change cost $3.2 billion, which is
tens of thousands of Canadians and several Indigenous communities to evacuate their homes. These fires have caused a problem for air quality across the country and beyond our borders. This type of event reminds us of the importance of doing more and doing it more quickly in terms of climate action. There are also droughts on the prairies, intense hurricanes on the East Coast, extreme flooding on the West Coast, and melting permafrost in the North. People pay the price of these impacts when they are forced to repair their homes or businesses after disasters. Tous ces impacts, les gens payent le prix.
People are paying the price for all of these impacts when they have to repair their houses. And as an example, just to repair the damage of Hurricane Fiona to Park Canada infrastructure, in this budget presents an additional expenditure of $8.7 million. The costs of the climate crisis are very real, and they will continue to climb as long as emissions continue to increase. We absolutely need to change course. At COP28, we received a wake-up call. The global stock take of signatories to the Paris Agreement, which occurs every 5 years, shows that we are not on track to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This means we need to pick up the pace and step up our investments. That is what Canada is doing. The expenditures I'm going to present today gives a snapshot of this. This first supplementary estimates is just over $380 million. As for my department's reference levels, I'd like to mention a few significant increases. In particular, there's an increase of $152.9 million in connection with carbon pollution pricing, which is the most effective way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This will be used to ensure the distribution of revenue from excessive emissions charges paid by companies. The output-based pricing system creates a financial incentive for industrial emitters to reduce their emissions. And in the end, it's the low and middle-income Canadian families who benefit the most. In today's inflationary climate, we're delighted that the payments into the system are making life more affordable for them. The supplementary estimates also include an increase of $38.8 million to continue implementing carbon pricing and the clean fuel regulations. This is another important component of Canada's climate plan. By encouraging the industry to reduce the carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel, our fuels will become cleaner over time, giving consumers more and more affordable alternatives for consumers. Among the other increases, I'd like to mention a reinvestment of $52.1 million in Canada's hydrometeorological services. These are critical services provided by a complex, integrated system. There are more than 3,000 weather monitoring stations across the country. We have complex models backed by cutting-edge scientific research to predict future conditions. We also have a number of specialized offices, such as the Storm Prediction Centers, which provide information 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We need this information to warn the population of the risk of natural disasters and to support core services such as aviation, emergency management, and military operations. The supplementary estimates B also include an increase of $13.8 million for Canada's National Adaptation Strategy, which was finally launched this year. This is the culmination of 2 years of engagement with the provinces, territories, Indigenous partners, and various experts. In the coming months, we will be working to bolster the safety and resilience of Canadian communities. For every dollar invested in adaptation now, we reduce the costs associated with future climate disasters. However, adaptation isn't just about responding to disasters. The strategy also aims to improve the management of risk to our health. We want to protect our livelihoods. We want to build resilient homes and infrastructure. We have already started on this path. We are developing an integrated climate lens, as announced in 2020, which will help integrate adaptation across the government. We are working with the provinces and territories to develop bilateral agreements and tailor federal programs to their specific needs. We are investing in the Green Municipal Fund to help develop local adaptation plans in our cities and towns. We have launched calls for proposals for the Climate-Resistant Coastal Communities Program, the Climate Change Adaptation Program, and the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. In short, beyond everything we do to reduce emissions, we also need to help communities adapt to the new climate realities. That is what the strategy will enable us to do. It will also enable us to strengthen adaptation action on a global scale, because this is a global crisis. Just like the biodiversity crisis, I'd like to highlight a few other additional expenditures aimed at funding the protection of species at risk in Canada. Environment and Climate Change Canada has reported a $22 million increase in its reference levels, and Parks Canada, whose mission includes protecting our natural spaces and ecosystems, has reported an increase of $7.7 million. This work is so important. Biodiversity is our great ally in the fight against climate change. Healthy ecosystems absorb carbon. They produce oxygen and help reduce emissions. This additional funding will help us protect 25% of Canada's land and sea territory by 2025 and meet our obligations under the Montreal Agreement on Biodiversity by 2030. Parks Canada will also be implementing conservation and restoration projects in various regions of the country in close collaboration with Indigenous communities. The agency ensures that Indigenous knowledge and values are respected in the management of natural areas. Parks Canada is also reporting an additional expenditure of $1.5 million to carry out 3 impact and benefit agreements with Inuit communities in Nunavut and Labrador, as provided for in the Act. These agreements will enable them to participate fully in the cooperative management of 5 national parks. This is essential, in our opinion. Across Canada, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities are disproportionately affected by climate change. They know their ancestral lands. They know how to recognize signs of imbalance in the environment. That is why, as I said in my opening remarks, we cannot advance climate change in Canada without promoting the leadership of Indigenous communities. Finally, the budget includes a request from the Impact Assessment Agency to support the development of renewable energy. The agency is requesting a transfer of $140,000 from the Department of Natural Resources to support its regional assessments of offshore wind development in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. This work will support the energy transition that is central to Canada's emissions reduction plan. Mr. Chair, I'm going to stop here, and I'm prepared to take the members' questions. Thank you, Minister. We'll begin with Mr. Deltel. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Minister, I'm happy to see you here. It's been 262 days since your last appearance. As you said, you've spent the last 2 weeks in the desert in Dubai, and we'd like to know what your bill is environmentally for that trip to Dubai. Well, as you probably know, and thank you for the question, Mr. Deltel, the department compensates for carbon offsets for this kind of travel. But you personally, well, we're going to publish that information. It has to be collected. But I'd like to remind the members of the committee that before the signature of the Paris Accord, we were living on a planet that was headed towards a 4 degrees Celsius increase. Well, you'll have time to talk about that later, but I have other questions to ask you now. Well, answer. Well, that's important now because these agreements are going to help us to avoid tens of billions of tons of pollution. So perhaps it's worth meeting from time to time to do that. Well, perhaps not in the middle of the desert, but people don't always understand. So during this meeting, what came out of this was that we have to transition away from fossil fuels. I'd like to know if you agree with the fact that so far and so long as we need fossil fuels, we have to use Canadian products. Do you agree with that? Well, what I said publicly many times is that according to the International Energy Commission, that we are in a world we are using 100 million barrels of oil a day, and we should be in a world where we use 25 million. So there needs to be a significant decrease in consumption and also in the production of these products. So do we have to make a priority of Canadian-produced fossil fuels or in this situation or not? Well, government doesn't decide who buys our products. It's the market that does, their businesses and clients, and we represent 5% of oil production in the world right now. Who knows what it'll be in 2050? Well, indeed, you come from Quebec, so am I. Let's talk about consumption in our province. You probably remember this article in Le Devoir that said that in Quebec we were consuming 18 billion liters of oil per year. Well, I don't remember that. Well, you can trust me. 18 billion liters of oil, it's a lot, but that's what people need. So we have also learned from this study that 48% of that oil comes from the United States. So do you feel that it would be better if it was Canadian energy and not American energy that we are using? Because that's millions and millions of dollars that we're sending out of the country. Thank you for the question. I imagine you're not trying to say that the government should bring back the National Energy Program and force provinces across the country to sell their oil to other Canadian provinces rather than to world markets. I think that's not what you're saying. I'm asking, do you think that Canadians should be buying Canadian oil products and not American or foreign oil? Well, what I think is that we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and that's what Quebec is doing. Quebec is the province, along with BC, that has the highest rate of adoption of electric vehicles. I don't know what, some 20% are electric or zero-emission vehicles nowadays, and I think that we're seeing that on the industrial level as well. So we're turning towards a world where we will consume less. Now, it's not up to the federal government to decide who businesses should sell their products to. No, but don't you think that we'd be better served as Canadians if we had Canadian energy that we used? You know, in Quebec, 47%. And compared to what we're sending to the United States, that's a huge amount of money. I have no problem with Americans, but can you tell us how much Louisiana spends in equalization payments, for example? Well, I honestly don't think that the Prime Minister and the premiers of the provinces would agree that the federal government should interfere in their decisions concerning the sale and purchase of oils. I often hear what the provinces and territories want to say to us, and they say that natural resources are not of the federal government, for the federal government to decide. Well, you make a lot of announcements, but you're not so strong in terms of achievements. So I'm talking about international figures here. You're at the head of a government that for the last 8 years, or you're a member of the government that has been leading Canada for 8 years. 8 years later is the worst country in the G7 in terms of pollution. We're one of the worst countries in the world in terms of implementation of existing agreements. So you came in 2015. What are you doing now? A report that was tabled this week at COP concerning greenhouse gas pollution says that Canada is number 68 or 60 on this list. So we look at Canada's record globally against other countries' records. We are in a worse position now than we were last year. Canada is now 62 on the list of countries around the world. So are you proud of this record? Well, I said it many times, but we are in a catch-up mode in Canada because for many years, how many years have you been in government? Answer, if you look at Great Britain, for example, you look at France, the Scandinavian countries, where systematically from the beginning of the 1980s there's been public policy in terms of climate change. Well, we're not here, I know, to talk about your... Okay, thank you. Your time is up. We'll go now to Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Merci. Thank you, Minister, for being here today and for explaining all of the different initiatives that you're taking and the supplementary amount of spending that's going in them to make sure we accomplish the goal of doing more and doing it more quickly as it's much needed. And the Price on Pollution program has been a topic of conversation for quite some time. And I was wondering if you could perhaps explain the different components of it, because there seems to be a preoccupation with focusing solely on what is referred to as the carbon tax and not mentioning at all the climate action incentive payments. So perhaps you could explain how this Price on Pollution program works and why it is a program that addresses affordability as well as addressing the much needed work we have to do to fight climate change.
Thank you for the question. It is important to note that the price on pollution will be responsible for somewhere in between 20 and 30% of the planned emission reduction by 2030, according to an analysis done by the department. So it is a key component of our climate action plan. And as you know, when we came into power in 2015, the projections by 2030 was that Canada was going to blown away past our target by 2030 by at least 9%. We've managed to eliminate that present that the previous government left for us and now have reduced emissions by 7% below 2005 levels, according to data that's already two years old, because that's how long it takes to compile inventory numbers in our countries. So we are on the right track. There is, in fact, an article that appeared in CBC earlier this week, or at the end of last week, saying that we're on track for the first time in our country's history to meet a target, the interim target we have for 2026. And pricing is an important component of this. And as you know, we use the revenues from the fuel charge of the carbon pricing system, and we return 90% of those revenues to households. And according to independent analysis, low-income and middle-income Canadians get more money back from carbon pricing than they pay. The richest among us don't, as we should. We shouldn't be getting money back, but for most Canadians, the vast majority of Canadians, they get more money back from the program. If we take that away, we're taking money away from Canadians.
Thank you. And the fact that the checks that Canadians get that are in the program, the backstop program, 4 times a year, they don't change. But the amount that a family might pay through this program would change if different choices are made by that family. Is that correct?
Some people have asked, why put in place a price on pollution and then give us money? Mm-hmm. And it's a rather simple and basic economic theory, is that you give a price signal, and then people can decide what to do. They can use the money that they get back from the government and continue with the same lifestyle that they have, and we will pay for the cost of the increased costs in carbon pricing. Or they can decide to change some of their behaviors, and then they have more money back in their pocket. They can go for a smaller vehicle. They can use some of our programs, home energy retrofit, to save money. Some will even decide to go for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles in Canada have tripled in the last 2 years. We were barely at 3%. We've passed 10% the first quarter of this year. So Canadians are seeing the multiple benefits of adopting less carbon-intensive lifestyle. And carbon pricing is a way we can help them do that.
Thank you very much for that. And it's also been said that the price on pollution, though, is causing inflation. And you referred to a CBC article. I read an article just recently, I believe it was in the Globe, that said that it was not the cause of affordability and inflation. And I was wondering if you could address that a little bit.
The Bank of Canada has specified that the price on pollution is responsible for 0.15% of the increase in cost of products in Canada, and said that it does not contribute to the price increase and to inflation that we're seeing. It is not one of the drivers of inflation in Canada, pure and simple.
Yeah. So why do you think there's such confusion around that then? Because it seems that a lot of people believe that this is the cause right now, and what can we do to address that?
I think it's a convenient scapegoat by some who do not believe that we should act to fight climate change, who think that fighting pollution will just happen on its own, which is why Canada has one of the worst records, because for decades, and certainly under the previous Harper government, nothing happened and pollution went up through the roof. At a time where affordability is an issue, they decided to use this as an excuse to say, you see, the government is making the cost of everything go up because of carbon pricing, but it's simply not true. And if it was just that it's not true, is that it is detrimental to Canada's ability to fight climate change and the role that we can play in the world. And by doing that, we are imposing on our kids and grandkids an incredible burden that they will have to live with. They will be more natural catastrophes.
On doit s'arrêter là pour...
I'm sorry, we'll have to hold you there to give Madame Posé the floor. Thank you to the Minister and your team for being here today. So you unveiled last week in Dubai the cap on oil and gas sector, and bring you back to the Commissioner of the Environment. He said that the delay in this measure explains to some degree the failure of the plan to meet its goal, which was to 40 or 45% of emissions by 2030. So we feel that in our party that it's been too long, even though we agree with the agreement. But when we look at the regulatory framework, it seems that the actual measure will be announced in 6 months' time. And so there's going to be some flexibility for oil companies, compensatory payments for some, and so we're afraid that it might not change much in the end. And it doesn't help for renewable energy investments. So it looks ambitious, but I've seen a lot of figures, and I'm getting mixed up. Sometimes we talk about 35%, 31%, the 2009 levels, the 2005 levels. And in the end, what you said about the reduction plan and the cap is that there were 14 megatons of greenhouse gas from the energy sector that they have permission to emit. And so you were criticized for the 2022 target, but now with all of those figures, I have the impression that there's no more ambition, and that the big oil companies are going to continue. Well, anyway, it's fascinating with all of these figures. Is this all flying under the radar? Because I don't know how you translate this, but you're a Quebecer. It's really complicated. It's confusing. So why are there still so many favors being given to the oil and gas sector in this? Thank you for the question. First of all, I don't share your interpretation of the most recent report of the Commissioner to the Environment, who's saying that we're not going to reach our target. He said that the window must be firm, and we have to act more quickly. But that's what I've said many times since I became Minister of the Environment. The update of the plan that we tabled, and Mr. Van Koeveren tabled it in the House last week, shows that we are at 90% of reaching our objective. So we can't say in 2023 that we're not going to meet the 2030 objective. We still have 7 years to do it. So for the CAP, it took 2 years to table the framework, and it was a long time. But I remind you that the development for clean energy objectives took 5 years. So since I became the minister, we wanted to reduce the time necessary to produce these regulations and develop them. We have tabled the framework for the regulations, and that will be out probably in the month of June. And about by 2025, we'll have the final regulations. So we will have developed it within 2 years. Yes, we're still tossing a lot of numbers around. As I said earlier, it's fascinating to see that the figures keep changing, because when you say 90% of the goals or the objectives for in the emissions plan, I've been told that Canada has almost no chance of meeting those goals. But we're saying that the emission projections aren't reliable. The implementation of different plans have significant shortcomings. You can't keep the minister hold them responsible for not reaching those objectives. So, I mean, we're just playing with the numbers, it sounds like. Well, no, we have to move more quickly in the deployment of these measures, and that's exactly what we've been doing since I became the minister. We announced the zero emission standard since I became minister, and on net neutrality, and other oil and gas. We're the only G7 country to have announced a plan to do away with fossil fuels. There's no other country in the world that has done this, so you know that is me. Well, I understand, Minister, but I know that it's not an easy position to take in a country that has Alberta and Saskatchewan that produces oil and gas, and Quebec, for example, that lives with clean energy. But coming back to the figures and what you were saying about COP28, you said that we have to get out of our comfort zone and become aware that our current measures are not enough to build a sustainable future. But this cap will only be in effect in 2026 and methane in 2027. So the Bloc agrees with these positions, but not so far out. I mean, does that reflect the urgency of the situation? Once again, by reducing by more than half the time needed to develop and deploy these measures. You're talking about methane. Oil and gas is going to see reductions in methane by 45% by 2025, so that's almost half. So we're not taking off from zero. We've already done part of the work, but 45% we're saying is not enough. We have to go even faster. So look at the electricity sector, the reduction in emissions. In fact, why does Canada has not managed to reach the goal? We have 7 years ahead of us, but there's one sector where the emissions are not going down. It's oil and gas. Thank you. Mr. Bachrach, you now have the floor.
Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. It's good to see you. I'll pick up where my colleague, Madame Posey, left off, talking about this question of whether indeed Canada is on track. And I think among several parties at this table, we want to see ambition and we want to see the work that is necessary being done to meet the promise that you've made to Canadians. And it's interesting because this committee heard maybe a month ago from the Environment Commissioner, and he told a very different story than the one that you're telling today. He said, and in his report, I'll read, it says, Environment and Climate Change Canada estimated that the measures in the 2030 emissions reduction plan were not expected to reduce emissions to the extent needed to meet the target. The Environment Commissioner, whose work is required as part of the Emission Accountability Act, has found that Canada isn't on track to meet either the 2026 objective or the 2030 target. And yet, ECCC's progress report that came out last week had a very different conclusion, said, everything's rosy, well on track to meet both the 2026 objective and the 2030 target. Now, the key criticism that the Environment Commissioner makes is that the projections that ECCC uses are overly optimistic. And I was looking through the progress report that includes these optimistic projections, and I noticed that for the oil and gas industry, for instance, it has a fairly precipitous drop in oil and gas emissions in 2023, back down to below the pre-pandemic levels. And I'm wondering, maybe my first question is, how should Canadians understand the contrast between the message we received from the Environment Commissioner and what you've put out, which is much more optimistic? And do you have information that suggests the oil and gas industry is going to reduce its emissions next year, the year after, and the year after that, as this modeling in your report clearly shows?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Bachrach. I think it's important to remember that, and it's not a criticism of the work of the Environment Commissioner, but his work is based on data that is already a year old. So when he did his report, we hadn't announced the zero-emission vehicle mandate. We hadn't announced the clean electricity regulations. We had not announced the new targets for methane. We hadn't announced the cap on oil and gas emissions. We hadn't phased out fossil fuel subsidies. So these are all new elements that have happened since the commissioner was able to do the work. Why? And on the issue of modeling, I mean, it is an extremely complex issue, but one of the things we have started doing, following recommendations by the Environment Commissioner, is to work with other organizations on modeling to perfect. It'll never be perfect, but improve the modeling that we do, and that we share this information so that other organizations, I can think certainly of at least one other, the Climate Institute, but as well as others can test whether or not the modeling that we're doing and the projections that are in the documents, like the progress report of the ERP, the emissions report, the emissions reduction plan, sorry, if those assumptions are valid. But I'll be the first one to acknowledge that it is a challenging sphere, and one where we're trying to improve year after year.
I guess what I'm getting at, Minister, is that your report that provides that optimistic projection shows emissions declining in the oil and gas sector, when we know that actually emissions in the sector are going up year over year. So I'm wondering why, like, the disconnect there. You have modeling that shows they're declining in the next 3 years before the oil and gas emissions cap is even in place. The emissions are expected to go down. We hear from Rich Kruger from Suncor and other CEOs. They want to expand production as quickly as possible. They want to make money and increase emissions like gangbusters. So how do we square the circle here? We've got an industry that's increasing emissions. We have a policy that doesn't come in until 2026. And we have a graph based on ECCC modeling that shows the emissions magically going down between now and 2026 from the oil and gas sector. Is that actually going to happen?
It's not magic, but it is going to happen.
Just to stop you there. It's going to happen. Emissions from the oil and gas sector are going to go down between now and 2026 when the key policy comes into force.
Briefly, please.
If I may, so you're basing your assumptions on the fact that the only thing that will result in emissions reduction in the oil and gas sector is the emission cap, whereas we've already implemented clean fuel regulations to reduce emissions from refineries. We already have methane regulations. We already have a price on pollution, which goes up year after year, and which will
and yet you very much. We have to go now to our second round with Mr. Mazur.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming out here today. Minister, will you provide the committee with all your meeting and expense details from the trip to Dubai?
As we always do, yes, of course.
So you'll provide those documents to the committee. Thank you very much.
Yes.
The Environment Director for the Chiefs of Ontario stated that the carbon tax, and I quote, exasperates the affordability issues for our citizens face. Do you agree with the Grand Chief's statement?
The Bank of Canada disagrees with that statement.
But do you agree with that statement?
I agree with the Bank of Canada statement that I referred to earlier in this testimony.
The Prime Minister says it's misinformation to say the carbon tax is costing Canadians more. Do you believe the Chiefs of Ontario and the Assembly of First Nations are spreading misinformation by saying the carbon tax is unaffordable, unfair?
As I said earlier, the Bank of Canada has stated that carbon pricing in Canada contributes to 0.15% to the inflation, and it is not a driver. It's not even 1% of contributed to the inflation. We have been discussing with Chiefs of Ontario for a while now how we can compensate them, and that was part of the program from the get-go, from the application of carbon pricing.
But, Minister, you haven't answered the questions. Do you believe the Chiefs of Ontario and the Assembly of First Nations are spreading misinformations by saying the carbon tax is unaffordable and unfair?
As I said earlier, we understand that for remote Indigenous communities, there are different realities in terms of being able to have alternatives to the use of fossil fuels, which is why we're working with them so that they can become. I said earlier that 90% of the revenues of carbon pricing goes back directly to families. The other 10% is for organizations or nations like those Indigenous nations, so that they can be compensated for the application of carbon pricing on their communities.
Is it unfair?
No, I don't think it's unfair because we are finding mechanism to compensate them.
Can you promise Canadians that your government will never raise carbon tax higher than $170 a ton?
We've made a determination until 2030. We haven't made any determination for what will happen after 2030.
See, you have once said that you won't raise the carbon tax, then you raise the carbon tax after an election. So now, after 2030, you will never go over $170 a ton.
I respectfully disagree with the characterization of what we said. We said that the price on pollution would increase until 2022, and then we said we would make an assessment to determine whether or not it should continue. That's exactly what we did.
So you're not committing to not going over $170 a ton, increasing costs to Canadians?
It's a decision that hasn't been made.
Did you call any senators to discuss Bill C-234?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Did you call any senators to discuss Bill 234?
I had conversations with 5 or 6 senators, yes.
5 or 6? What are their names?
5 or 6. I don't have them with me.
Can you table those?
I'm sure we can make those available, yes.
Okay, thank you.
I did not bully anyone, as opposed to some Conservative senators who had to apologize in the Senate for bullying some of their comments over 234. I had conversations. As you know, we don't tell senators how to vote or what to do.
That's okay. If you can pass on those names, that's great. And will your clean fuel regulations increase the cost of gas and diesel on Canadians? So will the clean fuel regulations increase the cost of gas and diesel on Canadians?
I'd be happy to provide technical information on the projections between now and 2030 in terms of the application of the clean fuel standards. This information is public. I just don't have it in front of me. But as you know, when we develop regulations, we have to develop what's called a regulatory impact assessment statement, which provides technical information.
Let me provide from that statement. How much time do I have left, Chair?
30 seconds.
So let me provide the information from this impact statement for clean fuel regulations. It states, and I quote, "The regulations are estimated to increase the price of gasoline and diesel." So, will the clean fuel regulations increase the cost of gas and diesel on Canadians? Yes or no?
I don't have it in front of me. I'd be happy to provide
so it's
a
from your
written...
own government
You're quoting
documents
from a
that
report
you've
that I don't have in front of me. I'd be happy to provide
This was
the
the impact
information.
assessment
Time's up,
before the decision
unfortunately,
was made.
Mr. Mazier. We'll go to Madame Chatel.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the committee. I hope that obviously your discussions were fruitful in Dubai, but thank you for having well represented us and with your delegation from the department. I have a question concerning the Conservatives' position on carbon tax, because looking at the oil and gas businesses in 2022, they had profits that were above $400 billion a year, something of that order. That's something unheard of. And we were talking earlier when Mr. Corson was here, who was the president of Imperial Oil. He has a salary of $17 million a year. And when I look at when you fill up the gas tank, what has caused, or what determines that price? The price of crude oil and the redistribution costs and so on. And so when I looked at all of that, I realized that a major part of what consumers pay goes indeed to the oil and gas companies. So when I hear the Conservatives say that we're going to do away with the carbon tax, as you were talking about earlier, which is responsible for 0.15% of inflation currently, that they're going to axe that, and they're going to take away the measure that sends money back to these people. So 90% of that of those taxes go back to families. But we're not doing anything for the major oil companies. If we really want to do something to help Canadians, would it not be time to look at the profits that the oil and gas companies are making? Thank you for the question. The figures you gave are not necessarily the ones that I've seen. For oil sands companies, it's more like $35 billion, according to analyses that have been done independently. The companies have invested 1.4% in decarbonization of that $35 billion. That's clearly not enough, in my opinion. And for greenhouse gas emissions, we want to ensure that investments are made in Canada by these companies in decarbonization and new technologies and employment, because currently they're not making those investments. And what probably will happen is that in a world that is more and more carbon neutral, where we'll still be using gas, but that has a very low carbon level, if we don't make these investments, our products won't be competitive with what happens or is made in other countries in the world, even other areas of Canada, like the Atlantic coast, where the extraction is 10 times less in terms of emissions than the oil sands oil. So I think if we want to have an industry and viable communities over the long term, we have to do these kinds of things. And I want to talk about biodiversity, because you know that in my riding we have a project that we're very interested in achieving our targets in the Outaouais, because you were saying biodiversity is one of the greatest allies that we have in order to try and achieve that carbon neutral state. So there's $139 million for conservation initiatives and $291 million for the Canadian Nature Fund and extra funding to protect species at risk. So could you talk to us a little bit more about how that might help regions such as mine in the Outaouais to better protect our biodiversity? Thank you very much for the question. Since COP15, we have signed 3 agreements with provinces and territories, including Yukon, Nova Scotia, and BC, where we have committed in collaboration with Indigenous peoples of those provinces or territories to work on the implementation to help with national parks and conservation. And over the last 2 months, we have announced agreements with the Northwest Territories, amongst others, and Nunavut as well, for the conservation of 1 million square kilometers of new protected areas. And these are all projects piloted by Indigenous peoples. And that equals 4 times the size of Great Britain. Thank you. Ms. Posey, I'll continue with the figures, Mr. Minister, because I find you very optimistic. Talk about the regulations on methane you were talking about earlier. You said 45% decrease by 2025. So once again, the Bloc Québécois applauds you for that measure. But it's the delay that we criticize. And the International Energy Agency confirmed that world emissions of methane are 70% higher than what the industry says is the rate. So the industry is self-identifying their emissions levels, and the International Energy Agency said that. So I don't believe in these self-declarations. We talked about the 2,000 meetings over the last 2 years with lobbyists. Does the Center for Excellence on Methane not have a mandate? They could talk to us about statements that are stable and independent in light of these regulations. So just two things quickly, and then Mr. Tremblay could give you more detail on the issue of the methane inventories. The president of the International Energy Agency was in Dubai when I announced the new regulations on methane. And he himself saluted that as being proof of Canadian leadership in terms of climate change. So Mr. Birol didn't do a lot of press conferences, but that is an indication of how important he feels that it is on the one hand. And furthermore, the regulation, we already have one on methane, and we're updating it. We have constitutional commitments to consult the provinces and territories and Indigenous peoples. So if we created regulations without consulting anyone, you'd probably be the first one to say, well, oh, you didn't speak to Quebec about that. No, well, I'm going to stop you there because of the time. What I want to come back to is that the international agency said that it's the industry, the energy sector, I think indicates that the rates are much higher than what the industry says. So, well, the Canadian government supports the development of technology, and we have a Quebec company that uses this new industry on greenhouse gas reduction, and the Aerospace Agency also. So we're talking about methane and CO2. It's the only technology in the world that's able to detect the methane emissions. The traditional methods that we have used to compile data on this, we're going to add this satellite information that we are collecting now, and this is something really new in the world. So sometimes there are fugitive emissions that are hard to identify. Mr. Bachrach.
I'm sure you agree that despite the policies that you mention, increased production of oil and gas is likely to result in increased emissions over the next few years until the oil and gas emissions cap comes into effect. And I think the real concern here is that 2026 is too late for that key policy to start making a difference. It's only 4 years before the 2030 target. And so what we're going to see between now and then is we're going to see emissions from this sector continue to rise. And then when that policy starts taking effect, it's going to be this unrealistic sprint to the target. And what's going to happen is that we're going to fall short yet again. This is the concern that the Environment Commissioner expressed as well. My question is, how do we expedite that timeline? You said earlier we need to pick up the pace. That is the core message that we're hearing from COP, from the international community. And yet what we see with the oil and gas emissions cap is a very status quo rollout of a policy. 3 years to develop the regulations. You spent all this time developing a framework, and now it's going to take the conventional amount of time to develop the regulations. How do we expedite that and cut that time down to half so that it comes into effect in 2024, late 2024?
I would argue that we have been able to cut the time it takes to develop our policies. The zero-emission vehicle standard the draft regulations were announced in December of last year. We will have final regulations by the end of this year.
Specific to the cap.
Well, the cap was, ZEV was a bit easier because a number of jurisdictions in the world have done ZEV before. The Americans are doing one. We've been working closely with the Environmental Protection Agency on that. The cap, no one else has done this.
But arguably, you've done a bunch of the work because you created the framework. A bunch of the work has already been done. Why does it still take 3 years to develop the regulation?
No, it doesn't take 3 years. It's going to take another year now that we have the framework to develop draft regulations and final regulations. It takes the team at the department a lot of time to develop these regulations, and we have a responsibility to do it right, because if we don't, then these policies or regulations will be shot down in the courts, and we're no better off.
It's 2023. The regulation is going to start taking effect in 2026. That's a lot of time. And the question is, how do we encourage the government to move more swiftly to ensure that there's enough time before 2030 to make those reductions? Because right now, it seems, even with the smaller reductions that you've committed to, which is less than the least cost pathway that's modeled in the emissions reduction plan, even with that less ambitious target,
we're out of time.
It's still a lot to do by 2030.
Yeah. Mr. Cram.
Out of time for a response also?
Well, we're up to 3 minutes.
Okay,
sorry, Mr.
sorry. I just wasn't sure.
Insert your answer in response to another question, of course. But. Well, go ahead, Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Guilbeault, thank you for joining us today. Minister, are you still the Executive Vice Chairperson of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development?
Yes, I am, as was one of your previous colleagues in the Conservative Party of Canada.
Yes, that leads into my next question, actually. So the other day, the National Post reported that your 2-day trip to Beijing last August cost $140,000. And when Stephen Harper's Environment Minister Peter Kent traveled to Beijing in 2014 to meet with the same council, his trip cost only $9,900, and that includes staff. So, Minister, why were your travel costs 14 times that of Stephen Harper's Environment Minister to fly to the same city to meet with the same council?
I haven't seen those numbers, so it's hard for me to comment. What I will say is that things have changed since 2015. We now have a memorandum of understanding with the government of China to develop policies on coal, on carbon pricing, on joint work on nature, which are things we didn't have. The meeting just in the last 2 days. We were there for 4 days. So I'd be happy. I mean, those information are public, but I don't have the comparison to 2014. I don't have those numbers in front of me.
Okay. Minister, in 2022, China approved the construction of 82 new coal-burning power plants, and for the first half of 2023, they approved another 50. Minister, do you support China's construction of these new coal-burning power plants?
As you probably know, Canada and the United Kingdom started a movement in 2017 called the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which started with those two nations and about 20 others, small island states. This organization now spans more than 170 members, including the United States of America, including pension fund investors. And through the work of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, we've been able to cancel 75% of new coal of planned new coal construction in the world, but there's still lots of work to do to fight coal, and we believe that scientists tell us that one of the most important things we can do to fight climate change in the short term is focus on coal and focus on methane. That's exactly what we're doing.
And so when you visited Beijing last August, did you criticize the Chinese government for their ramping up of coal production and burning coal?
We have a work plan with the Chinese government to work with them so that we can help them reduce their dependency on coal. That's what we're doing.
But did you criticize them, or did you encourage them to build more? I mean, 82 new coal-burning plants last year and 50 for the first half of this year is a lot of new coal being burned in China. Given your role on the CCI-CD, have you played any role in trying to reduce those numbers?
Yes, absolutely. We're one of the world's leading advocate for the reduction of coal-fired electricity. Purely and simply, with the United Kingdom, we're leading the charge globally. So absolutely, that's what we're doing.
Have you encouraged China to transition away from coal and towards natural gas?
We've started the conversation with the Chinese, the Ministry of the Environment, on a number of initiatives, including coal, but that work hasn't concluded. What I would say is that we have to be careful because we have to phase out fossil fuels, all fossil fuels, including natural gas. And now in most parts of the world, and that's certainly true in Canada, it's cheaper to produce electricity from renewables than it is from natural gas, and it's certainly true in your own province of Alberta, where the cost of producing energy through renewables is cheaper than through natural gas, which is why what's being built right now in Alberta is mostly renewables, because it's cheaper than gas.
Okay, a couple of things. I'm from Saskatchewan, not from Alberta, but do you feel that Canada could play a useful role in exporting liquefied natural gas to China to displace the use of coal in that country?
There are a number of LNG projects that either have been approved or are on the process of being approved. As you know, the federal government doesn't develop resource-based project. This is a prerogative of provinces. So, but we have approved a certain number of LNG projects, and some are under impact assessment review right now.
10 seconds.
Okay, so if you look at the LNG facilities being built in the United States and Australia and the Middle East, they've been building dozens over the last few years. Canada has only one under construction. Why do we have so few LNG facilities here in Canada compared to other countries?
Very briefly, Minister, before we go on to Mr. Longfield.
You should talk to the provinces who are developing those projects.
Mr. Cram, we're done here. Mr. Cram, we're way over time. Mr. Longfield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here. What a terrific discussion we're having today. You're certainly fielding a range of questions. I'd like to go back to the supplementary estimates that you're here to discuss with us. In the estimates, there's $33 million that's included in support of initiatives to help to get us transition to the cleaner fuels that you're talking about, things that will help us in terms of preventing pollution. I'm looking at how we change behaviors through $33 million on measures to prevent pollution as we're introducing clean fuel standards to try to both provide a carrot and a stick.
That's the education.
That's the, Linda, could you, John? John? If you don't mind, Mr. Longfield, our friend, Mr. Moffat.
It's technical, so thank you. Yep.
Yes.
The money that you're referring to is money that's come to the department to support the implementation of those regulations.
Right, and by supporting the implementation, that's helping in the transition?
No, well, I mean that's to hire staff to make the staff that we hired to develop the regulations to make those staff permanent. We also need staff. We also need electronic reporting systems that we maintain. We have staff that are required to support the implementation of those systems and to answer questions, to do compliance promotion, that sort of thing. This is standard with respect to any kind of regulation that we develop.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for clarifying. Also in the supplementary estimates, there's $139 million for conservation initiatives, $291 million for the Canada Nature Fund, and additional funding to help protect species at risk. Could you share with the committee the progress that our government is making to protect species at risk while conserving our natural environment, something near and dear to us in Guelph because of the Greenbelt initiatives and the other initiatives down in Niagara?
Thank you very much for the question. When our government came into power in 2015, Canada wasn't protecting even 1% of our oceans and coastline. Next year, we should be at 20%, a staggering jump. And in 2015, we were protecting about 10% of our terrestrial lands. Again, we will be at the end of 2024, roughly at 20%. So we're on our way to meeting our interim goal of protecting 25% of each of these categories by 2025, on our way to at least 30% for each by 2030, as per the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
Great, thank you. And I may have confused the 33 million with the 34 million that is being put into the clean fuel regulations to help with innovations. Could you share with the committee on how introducing innovations at the same time as clean fuel regulations will help people to avoid the costs of doing nothing? Particularly in the agriculture sector.
We can come back with you in writing for this specific question. I mean, we are obviously supporting the development of innovation in the fuel sector. We're seeing a lot of. I mean, we've seen about $2 billion worth of projects being announced, whether it's in Saskatchewan, your province, my apologies, whether it's Quebec, Newfoundland for biofuels, and in some cases, traditional refineries being retrofitted to be able to accommodate for these innovations. So I believe some of this money is used to support companies as they develop new technologies and they implement them.
Great, thank you. I know I'm getting really, really short on time. I wonder, Mr. Chair, maybe I could make a motion to adjourn?
Well, yeah, we're done basically. No, the minister said he'd be, yes.
It's a dilatory motion.
Yeah, so we have to vote on it, but yeah. Minister said he'd give us an hour, that he'd be here.
Is this the first time I've had a chance since being elected to ask this minister a question? And just because this member decides to adjourn on behalf of his minister, that's unacceptable.
No, but the idea was always that he would come for an hour. And
one in my calendar.
Excuse me, just by way of background, I built in the extra half hour because of votes potentially interrupting, and also because we've often had motions tabled that caused delay, and I wanted to make sure that the minister would be here for at least an hour, even if we had votes and even if we had motions in between. So he's given us more than an hour. But anyway, we have what's your point of order, sir?
Dilatory motion and undebatable.
That's
so
right.
we shouldn't be debating it, and you shouldn't be debating it either.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not debating the motion. I'm giving you some background. Okay, let's vote.
Can we go to the vote?
Mr. Ali?
Yes.
Madame Chatel? Mr. Longfield?
Agreed.
Ms. Taylor-Roy?
Oui.
Mr. Vancouverden?
Yes.
Monsieur Datel?
No.
Mr. Krim?
Opposed.
Mr. Leslie? Mr. Mazer?
This is a motion to adjourn.
Yes.
Opposed.
Madame Posey?
No.
Mr. Backrack?
So we're not adjourning.
That's right.
Okay. Minister, I don't know what your schedule is. We can only go another 15 minutes because we lose the resources after 15 minutes. Are you okay with staying another 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I don't know how we're going to do this in terms of apportioning the time. I'm going to have to make a calculation to make sure everyone gets their fair share. So we've got 15 minutes. I don't know about that, but I'll tell you what, I think this will work. 2.5 minutes each, and we'll cut it in half. 2.5 minutes and a minute, and a minute, and whatever it is, the 1.2 minutes. So anyway, let's. Who wants to go for the Conservatives for 2.5 minutes? Mr. Leslie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for staying a little bit longer, Minister. I appreciate your acknowledgement of calling senators regarding 234. I'm just curious, given that you were so adamant to not give another carve-out to Canadian farmers and to therefore lower food prices, given the First Nations of Ontario, the Chiefs of Ontario, and their stated opinions, I know I'll get ahead of it, you're going to hide behind the Bank of Canada. So you're either going to say whether or not you believe the chiefs of Ontario that are suing your government when they say that life has become unaffordable because of their carbon tax, or are you going to say you don't believe them? But will you possibly think of giving another carve-out to First Nations communities that are taking on an undue burden of your carbon tax?
We have been working with these nations and others as well so that they can receive their share of the fuel charge through carbon pricing.
So why are they suing you? If you work as well with them as you do with provinces, it seems like. And on that note, the fact is that you said earlier that provinces that say that the Fed shouldn't interfere with their natural resource development, which I appreciate that you've acknowledged that. However, your track record in the courts this year doesn't add up. Obviously, with the Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines bill being slapped down by the Supreme Court, a host of other cases being slapped down due to the unconstitutional nature of your imposition on provinces' right to regulate their own prosperity in the natural resource sector. So my question to you is, did you seek external legal opinions over your clean electricity regulations, as well as your new methane proposed methane regulations, as to the constitutionality of them, particularly given the recent Supreme Court decisions regarding your imposition on the provinces?
There's been no recent Supreme Court decisions. There's been an opinion by the Supreme Court on impact assessment. It's not a decision. There's a difference. And there's been a federal court judge that has disagreed with our list on plastic pollution. We've already said we would appeal. You seem to forget that there was also a decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, not an opinion, not a federal court judge, that said that the federal government can act on matters of pollution, more specifically climate change pollution, and through carbon pricing, and that's exactly what we're doing. And we're using a similar mechanism for electricity. As for methane, I find it difficult to understand why the province of Alberta would be against a new methane regulations when they have supported the previous ones. So it's okay for us to develop
Time's up.
methane
We'll go to Madame Châtel. I'm sorry I have to be strict at this point, but that's the way it is.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My question is the following. While the Conservatives would like to bring us back to the Stone Age in terms of climate change, the world is moving forward with carbon taxes on a global scale. There's a lot of international effort in this regard, and also there is a carbon adjustment at the border. So if we go back to the Stone Age on climate change, or climate action, what's going to happen to our economy when we're going to wish to export to countries that do have a carbon tax and that we would no longer have it? Well, it's an excellent question, and I'd be really curious to hear the representatives of the Conservative Party comment on that, because the European Union is developing that at their borders, and the U.S., our biggest trade partner, is developing such a tax at the border as well. So if we do away with the carbon tax in Canada, we will have to pay this carbon tax imposed by Europeans and Europe rather, and the U.S. So I'd really like to hear them on this. We're going to threaten the economic prosperity of our country for ideological reasons, because we have no plan otherwise. I mean, you can't say you believe in something if you're not prepared to act on it. And yet that is the position that the Conservative Party finds itself in. So in acting so irresponsibly, they are threatening the economic prosperity of Canada and, of course, the environmental prosperity and of the world for our children and grandchildren. So that represents job losses, increases in prices of products as well. So in terms of affordability, we'd be taking a big step backwards if we don't follow what the major economies of the world are doing. Well, it's hard to identify the costs if there are customs taxes imposed by the U.S. and Europe and other countries on Canada if that kind of measure was taken. But there will be an impact. That's very, very clear. We just have to look at what's happening in terms of tariffs on softwood, which affects thousands of jobs in Canada in the forestry sector. Imagine those repercussions over a broad number of sectors, whether it would be sales of food, technologies, car parts, all of these sectors that are exporting ones. I have to stop you there, Ms. Posey. You have about 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay. I'm obsessed with numbers today. $83 billion to oil companies in assistance and $3.5 in tax credits in the recent economic update. They're making record profits. They don't need gifts from us. They have the means to invest if they believe in carbon capture and storage, which they're not doing. They're taking taxpayers' money, and the government is giving them taxpayers' money. So 2,000 lobbyist meetings, we can see the influence of that by Canadian oil companies. The Canadian government is giving them taxpayers' money where they have more than enough money on their own to invest in cleaning up their pollution. So don't you find that scandalous? Well, the definition of the of a subsidy is an advantage that we give to a particular sector. So the tax credits put in place for carbon capture and storage is not a benefit that is only offered to the oil and gas sector. It is to all businesses that want to use that technology. So it won't be just for that sector, and they will have to compete with others. That's why we have eliminated subsidies to the oil and gas sector, but there's public funding that wasn't part of the G20. We're working on that. Thank you.
Minister, in 2021, you promised to, quote, introduce a clean electricity standard that will achieve a 100% net zero emitting electricity system by 2035. And yet I have analysis here from ECCC that shows that in 2035, according to your new policy, there's still going to be 9 megatons of emissions on the grid. How is retaining a grid that emits 9 megatons per year net zero?
Because those emissions will have to be compensated. The commitment was not to have a fossil fuel free.
No, but it says net zero
by 25.
So
yes,
they will have to be compensated by what?
By different mechanisms.
But what are the
like offsets, for example, which are an agreed upon mechanism as part of the Paris Agreement, and Canada's making very.
So you're saying that those 9 megatons will have to be offset using credible offsets in 2035?
We're developing different protocols for offsets, which will not be specifically for the
and those 9 megatons will have to be offset?
For the electricity sector. Our goal is to have a net zero grid by 2035.
Those 9 megatons will have to be offset?
That's what we're working towards.
Okay.
Mr. Deltel.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You asked the first question about the bill. There are a lot of people are interested in the debate, and it's 18.1 tons of CO2 for your trip to Dubai return. So I would like to know how you personally are going to compensate for this. You went personally, not the department. I know when you became minister, you said that you crossed the country in a train, and you really believe in this, so show it by saying what offsets you can provide for the 18.1 tons of CO2. Now, the minister named an ambassador for the environment, Ms. Stewart, and she reported some spectacular costs for her travel. Over the first year of her mandate, she made 23 trips abroad, and obviously she just went to Maine. She went to Paris, Lisbon, Rome, Florence, Abu Dhabi, Bali, London. She likes to travel, this woman. So that is the equivalent of about one trip every 2 weeks. So I understand she's an ambassador. She has to represent Canada. We understand that. But honestly and sincerely, between the two of us, a trip every 2 weeks, have you ever traveled that much? Well, if we didn't have international cooperation on these issues, we would have an increase in temperatures of 4 degrees Celsius. And so thanks to the Paris Agreement, and this, you can read this, we are heading for a 2.3 increase instead of 3. So every 1/10 of a degree of a reduction is billions of tons of pollution that won't be in the atmosphere. And I think it's worth, we have an ambassadress, and she's based in Europe, by the way, so indeed, so that she can limit her transatlantic trip. So she's based in Germany. Going to London or to Paris is much closer than if I was to do that. So what is her bill for those 23 trips environmentally? We find it really to be too much. You don't find it too bad, but what is the bill? I can't believe you weren't aware of this. Well, this is where I deeply disagree with you, Mr. Deltel, because if it was only for this work done internationally against climate change, there would be billions more tons of pollution in the air here. Ms. Stewart, the interpreter regrets, but two people are speaking at the same time. Mr. Van Koeverden, you have the floor, and then we'll be ending.
I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Deltel, for retabling the CCPI report, because the rankings are one thing, and they are concerning. However, looking at how they arrive at those rankings and what their recommendations is very, very important as well. The number one thing that they point to is oil and gas production is on the rise, and the emissions from that sector are the only ones that are on the rise in our economy, and they point to that as more or less the sole reason for our ranking. Now, Alberta is by far the highest, and they're constantly fighting the federal government in court regarding our jurisdiction to reduce those emissions. But like I said, the recommendations in the CCPI report that my colleague, Mr. Deltel, raises are the most important. So I'm going to list them, Minister, and I'd appreciate if you could keep track and let me know which ones our federal government has a plan for. Number one, a strong oil and gas emissions cap. Number two, a fossil fuel phase-out from the provinces, which supports workers. Three, an emissions reductions plan, which is transparent. And four, a climate-aligned financial regulatory system. So of those four, Minister, which ones do we have a plan for? A strong oil and gas emissions cap, a fossil fuel phase-out from the provinces, which supports workers, an emissions reductions plan, and a climate-aligned financial regulatory system.
So I hadn't seen those recommendations, but by the looks of it, 3 of 4 we're in the process of, we've either implemented or we're in the process of implementing. We've announced a framework for the cap. We have an emissions reduction plan, which many have said was the most transparent and most complete in the world. Number 2, it would obviously be in a province court. And on the alignment of financial flows, the first thing we did was eliminate the fossil fuel subsidies, but we are working, as per the fall economic statement, to implement further measures on taxonomy and climate disclosure.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I hope that given that Conservatives continually use the CCPI report to advance their claims, they'll also get behind those 4 recommendations. Merci beaucoup.
I want to table this report, but unfortunately we refuse each and every time.
Je tiens à vous remercier, Monsieur le Ministre.
I want to thank you, Minister, for being with us today for a bit longer than planned. And now I have no choice but to adjourn the meeting because we have no more resources as of now. So I'll see you later, and happy holidays to everyone. Have a good rest, and look forward to seeing you again in January.
Thank you.